Until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. A very good morning to all my Indian brothers and sisters, teachers, scholars, and academicians. Also, a very good afternoon and a very good evening to all my friends from abroad. Today is the second last day of the International Lecture Series organized by All India Forum for English Scholars, Students, and Trainers. I, on behalf of AIFEST, welcome you all to the second last day. Coming back to the very intricacy or coming back to the very core of our lecture, I just love to give you a brief idea. Whenever we follow certain practice or we abide by any kind of certain idea, we tend to forget that there can be a lot of mistakes. We tend to forget that there can be a lot of things which we are doing, but we are not really aware of how wrong or how incorrect they can be, if I can use that word. Because we have always longed for that. And that specific longing, which have in a way been coming back to our mind or like haunting us for quite a time, for quite long. And once we get it, once we come to the scene, which is like finally we have got it. And that scenario in a way renders us a state of elation, a state of some kind of an excitement, which is pretty in a way disturbing because we tend to forget how incorrect we can be. And that specific core is our main aim in today's lecture. At this very moment, at this very specific juncture, I have an ambivalent feeling. The reason being that I'm very much elated and also quite sad. I have a deep grief at the moment. I'm elated because the topic for today's lecture is post-colonial studies, which I deeply love, which I quite fascinated about, and which I am quite interested also because I love post-colonial studies. And I am sad, I just have some kind of an unseen grief because the speaker, the resource person for the day is my teacher. And it's really an honor for a student to be organizing something for his teacher. And this very feeling or this very mixed feeling is really rendering me a state which is troublesome, to be very honest. Okay, then to brief you all about our chief guest or about our resource person, he is Mr. Prabhas Pandith. And just to give you his brief introduction, Mr. Prabhas Pandith, currently the assistant professor and the head of the department, Sri Honnadevi Government First Degree College in the Tumkur district of Karnataka. After completing his BA degree in journalism, English literature, and psychology from SDM College, he did his master's in English from the University of Hyderabad. He has an MPhil degree from the same university, for which Mr. Pandit worked in the areas of colonial discourse and nationalist narratives, focusing specially on the appropriation of the Bhagavad Gita by the intelligentsia of 19th and 20th century India. At present, he is working on his doctoral research at Tumkur University in the broad area of comparative science of cultures. His work involves looking at the differences in the conception of technical terminologies in various renderings of the Bhagavad Gita. He has a healthy interest in the areas of literary and cultural theory, post-colonial studies, American poetry, Kannada literature, translation, creative writing, and film studies. Mr. Pandit has designed and conducted certificate courses on poetics, aesthetics, advertisement analysis, and film appreciation. He has also been a consultant for a couple of educational institutions, helping them with design and delivery of courses, mainly in literary theory. He has developed several invited lectures as well. He has authored research papers for journals and has also written articles for Prajavani, a respectable Kannada daily. Sir, we are really humbled, we are really honored to have you here, and I just express my overwhelming gratitude to you for having accepted my invitation. Over to you. Professor, it's all yours now.
Thank you, Avilash. It's such a pleasure to be a part of this wonderful series of lectures. It's doubly pleasing considering my student Avilash is organizing. At the outset, I would like to congratulate all the members of the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity, and also for organizing such a wonderful series of lectures. We need to make most of this bad situation, so that way, if it gives an opportunity to meet each other and share our ideas, even if it is on online platform, it's still it's in a way putting this particular period to good use. Before I proceed, I would like to just confirm, am I being audible? Can everyone see the screen of my presentation?
So you are audible, but your screen is not on the picture, I guess.
Okay, right. It says I am presenting. Okay.
Yes, sir. Now you are presenting. Now
okay,
you can.
Is my PPT present? Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay. Then fine. Okay.
Yes, so you can go ahead now.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now, so my talk is titled "File Your Claims Here: Perpetuating the Post-colonial Pain." So probably one may be able to guess by this particular title that this is more it is an attempt at critiquing post-colonial theory as it stands today, post-colonial studies in general, than to celebrate its achievements. Now, this doesn't mean that post-colonial studies is a total bogus, as Spivak called. Of course, she meant it in a slightly different way. I do not believe that post-colonial studies does not have or do not have their uses, but it's just that it is possible that when one is completely engulfed in such theoretical practices, it is possible that we do not see the horizon of our actions, where they are leading us to. So I would like to take up the example of one of the playwrights, Kannada playwrights, a very well-known playwright, Girish Karnad, and I would like to take the example of the last play that he wrote, Crossing to Talikota, and would like to illustrate what I think is only a single example, or one example of how the intellectual concerns of post-colonial studies has probably led us astray, or at least has the potential to lead us astray if we do not consider it in a self-reflexive manner. So this is the layout of my presentation. In the beginning, I would quote Alison Donnell and what she had predicted post-colonialism would become. And then I would try to illustrate that her misgivings about post-colonial studies were rather well placed. And for that purpose of illustration, I would use Girish Karnad's Crossing to Talikota. So in September 2019, the Amsterdam Museum, one of the Netherlands' most prestigious museums, declared that it will no longer use the term golden age, it's pronounced gouden eeuw, to describe the 17th century, the 17th century Netherlands achievement, when Netherlands was at its pinnacle as a military and trading power. Now, the reason why the museum refused to use this term or to drop this term, the golden age, was that they saw it as an attempt to be polyphonic and inclusive, because they thought that golden age is only representative of a particular class of people and also a particular nationality of people as such, because at that time Netherlands was in itself a colonial power. And also there were several within the Netherlands who did not stand to benefit from the golden age as such. So the museum said that the term golden eeuw, or as they pronounce it, gouden eeuw, did not do justice to those who were exploited during that particular time. The treatment of the Dutch colonial period in public spaces has become a matter of keenly contested debate in the recent years. After that, there were several movements in the Netherlands and other parts of the Europe, for that matter, where some of the busts were removed, some of the statues were removed. I think people would recall how there was a movement against Gandhi's statue in one of the universities in Africa because Gandhi was seen as racist, as a racist. Now, whether Gandhi is a racist or not is a different issue. That is a different issue. But at least when we are focusing on Netherlands and other European countries, there is a movement where the Europeans are becoming increasingly embarrassed with their own colonial history. That embarrassment is actually well placed. I mean, nobody would take offense at such a thing. However, to drop certain terms as golden age would also tantamount to obliteration of a part of their own history. Now, post-colonial studies, which is very deeply concerned with history and memory, if these studies influences this sort of an activity, I'm not too sure that would be one of the acceptable effects of post-colonialism. The present Prime Minister of Netherlands, Mark Rutte, I don't know whether that is the way to pronounce, I think it's Mark Rutte. Anyway, he cautioned against judging the distant past through today's eyes. He said that it was a danger thing. This entire episode is actually very unsettling for the likes of me. Me sitting in India, a citizen of a post-colonial society which was once colonized. I would want the colonial powers to acknowledge the hegemonic ways with which they operated years ago. But at the same time, it would not be an acceptable thing for me to expect them to discredit themselves of what can be called an achievement. Again, that term is debatable, but a part of their own history, for that matter. In that way, I will certainly agree with Mr. Rutte's sentiments in this case. I would have vehemently opposed the ban on the term the golden age. So I started wondering, if this isn't one of the undesirable effects of what is broadly called post-colonialism. What more, this self-critical attitude gains complexity when placed within the context of a post-colonial society. What should we do as post-colonial subjects? Do not we have parts of our own history which would still mean hegemonic? So should we, to what kind of a distance should we maintain from such a past? To what extent should we involve ourselves? Should we also obliterate a part of our history? Because after all, every period in history would be hegemonic in one sense or the other. There is never a period in history that has not been hegemonic and has not oppressed, where people have not been oppressed. So as a post-colonial subject, what parts of my history should I be skeptical about? Should I be embarrassed about, or should I in a way be ambivalent about it, or what should be the nature of my ambivalence? These are some of the questions that becomes very relevant to me. So when I was reading the episode of Netherlands, I started also at that same time I was reading also Karnad's last play, The Crossing to Talikota, which takes up this question of how to respond to one's own history. So I thought that here is a very interesting but a contrasting response to what is happening. So today I would like to take that up and then think about post-colonial studies in a broad way. Before I go ahead with the play in itself, let me draw your attention to an article written by Alison Donnell in 1995, which is titled "She Ties Her Tongue: The Problems of Cultural Paralysis in Post-Colonial Criticism." In that particular essay, she had warned that post-colonial studies may meet its premature end because of wider political imperatives, institutional pressures, and an entrenched cultural protocol. So these things, wider political imperatives and its institutional pressures, and which also mean ideological pressures, and then their cultural protocol would actually render post-colonial studies handicapped. They render it a handicap to deal with the complexities of today. This she wrote in 1995. Her fundamental question was how legitimate are the readings within the post-colonial studies that attempt at what Spivak termed de-hegemonization of discourses. The post-colonial studies evidently is against hegemonic discourses and also tries to de-hegemonize these discourses. But in the process of de-hegemonizing the discourses, how legitimate are our readings is something that she she took up, Alison Donnell when she wrote this particular article. She had then accused post-colonialism of perpetrating the terrorism of cultural sensitivity. I wish I had gone deeper into this particular phrase, but this probably will lead to certain other things. Maybe we can take it up for some other discussion. But this term, probably it is self-evident to everyone. In a way, it can be related to the banner of victimhood, or the card of victimhood that some post-colonial subjects are too happy to flash. So this terrorism of cultural sensitivity is what she expected post-colonial studies, expected to turn into post-colonial studies nemesis. So it's amusing, how today it seems to me that taking this cultural sensitivity has marched in a single direction to such an extreme length that it has proven to be culturally insensitive. We have, taken this cultural sensitivity to such an extreme that today we are not actually sensitive culturally at all, in a sense. So I'll try to demonstrate this with this, how this problem persists even today, the problem that Alison Donnell raised, how it persists even today by attempting a reading of Girish Karnad's last play, Crossing to Talikota. So in this part of the presentation, I would like to look at Crossing to Talikota from two tropes as such. One is the private versus public domain debates, and also a debate between the form of different types of narratives. Historical drama on one hand, and on the other, historiographical narratives. Before we proceed, since there are many people from abroad, just a very brief introduction into Karnad. He was a Kannada, playwright. He was a celebrated Kannada playwright, Girish Karnad, and he has been awarded with Gnanapith Award, which is the highest literary award in India. He passed away just the last year, and therefore he is very much a contemporary writer. Now, in a way, I'm considering Girish Karnad a post-colonial playwright, but I am very much aware that labeling Girish Karnad as a post-colonial playwright is somewhat simplistic. But he was certainly among the prominent post-independent Indian writers who reacted against nationalistic narratives produced during the colonial period. Aparna Bhargava Dharwadkar, who is a leading authority on Girish Karnad, in her book Theatres of Independence, argues that Karnad belongs to the neo-traditionalist movement in the post-independence Indian theatre that has produced anti-realistic and anti-modern plays. But when they're doing it, especially Karnad, even as Karnad is a neo-traditionalist playwright, he interrogates the received notion of nationalist narratives about Indian culture and tradition. So many of his historical plays based on historical events, offer a counterpuntal reading of mainstream narratives of our history, Indian history. So as Dharwadkar points out, Karnad employs indigenous forms, but disclaims any interest in perpetuating the categories of cultural purity and authenticity. So, she, in her study of Karnad and several other post-independent Indian playwrights, Aparna Dharwadkar, she argues that Karnad and other players are are among the playwrights who have turned to Indian myths and legends and also history not just to recover an ideal past as the nationalist narratives did, not to recover an ideal past, but to reappraise and de-idealize the Indian past. So this would definitely become an example of the project of what Spivak called de-hegemonizing discourses. Now the play, Crossing to Talikota, is set on a very, very important historical event, which is the fall of the Vijayanagara kingdom. The Vijayanagara kingdom was one of the most glorious and impressive kingdoms in India around 15th and 14th and 15th century. So it practically ruled over the entire Deccan area, and since as the name of the empire suggests, it was a Hindu kingdom. I mean, I don't know whether we can actually categorize it as a Hindu kingdom, but we can definitely agree that the rulers, of course, were Hindus. So it was seen by some as a Hindu kingdom. Now, as you can see on your screen, this entire South India, even parts of Sri Lanka, were under Vijayanagara kingdom. Even the Gajapatis of Orissa were actually, they were tributaries of Vijayanagara Empire. Even the Calicut and Sri Lanka were tributaries, and even the Bahmani kingdom, which includes Bijapur and then Bidar, Golconda, and also Ahmednagar. All these were, in a way, almost acted as vassals to the king Vijayanagara, the ruler of the Vijayanagara Empire. And the crossing to Talikota presents the historic moment when the Bahmani sultans came together against Vijayanagara Empire, and an amazing surprise turn of the tables, they actually managed to defeat the unthinkable almost until then. They managed to defeat Vijayanagara, the army of the Vijayanagara kingdom, and with that, many people argue that for the first time in history, Muslim rulers could exert their power over Deccan, and that continued for a long time after that. So this is the historical background, and the play is actually about the battle and the incidents that preceded this particular battle, immediately preceded this particular battle. So the mainstream readings of this particular battle is that this particular battle marked the end of, or rather it is a pinnacle moment in the Hindu versus Muslim battles and a clash of civilizations, and the practical and modern, or rather during those times, modern and eclectic Muslim armies trumped over an obsolete and also a self-absorbed Vijayanagara kingdom. So this is the, in a way, the mainstream narrative. The Muslims were happy with this sort of a reading because it projected them as the rightful winners. At the same time, the Hindus were happy with this because they could see themselves as victims of this particular Islamic invasion, as such, within quotes. So this is the background. Now, what happens after the Vijayanagara, the battle of Talikota, the Vijayanagara Empire fell, and their capital Hampi went to ruins. This we know that. Now, let me give you a very brief summary of what happens in the particular play. Now, this is Karnad's reading of the play, of course. Karnad wants all the readers to understand that the battles between the Muslims and Vijayanagara Empire, the Islamic Sultanates and Vijayanagara Empire, was not a binary as such. The Bahmani Sultans themselves fought among each other. Sometimes Vijayanagara Empire used to help some of them, and once they had helped Qutub Shah, and then again they had helped Ahmednagar, and then at a different stage they had helped Ahmednagar against somebody else. So it was a very complex kind of a relationship. It was not always us versus them or Vijayanagara versus the Sultanates, but it was more of a fluid arrangement, as it happens among when somebody is playing politics. And also Karnad wants us to understand that the Ramaraya was almost like a tyrant figure, and he wanted each of his tributaries to acknowledge his supreme authority. And at times, he used to go to great extent to humiliate his tributaries, and he wanted them to acknowledge that they are perpetual beneficiaries of his beneficence as such. So he wanted to be acknowledged as the generous father figure, and all others are eternally. He expected them to be eternally grateful to him. This probably was created simmering discontent among the sultanates, and they were always waiting for an opportunity. There were several battles, even every time Vijayanagara had defeated the other sultans, and the sultans were pardoned after, of course, humiliating them efficiently, and they were pardoned. And at one particular point, the sultanates of the Bahmani kingdom, they come together. The play says that one of the wives of one of the sultans, that is the Begum of Ahmednagar, comes up with a brilliant idea that the warring sultans should come together in a marriage alliance, and then that would render them into an extended family, and then that would give them a motive to come together and fight against the Vijayanagara Empire. And whether this happened historically or not, the play reads it that way. There are episodes and events in the play that suggest this. Not suggest it; it's pretty clear. And the Sultan of Ahmednagar, Nizam Hussain Shah, he takes the advice, and his daughters are married into other two, Qutub Shah and Adil Shah of other Bijapur and Ahmed, Golconda and Bijapur, and they become one family, and they come against, they fight against Vijayanagara, and as history would have it, they actually managed to defeat Ramaraya. But the reason is that Ramaraya was self-absorbed. The entire Vijayanagara kingdom never was in a way so self-absorbed that they never considered the sultans a threat. They were engrossed and they had become careless and callous. And also they did not equip themselves with modern technology. And all these led to their downfall. And also because of the main character, Ramaraya, because he always thought that he did not have the expected affinity with the kingdom that he was ruling, because he always thought that he was not the ruler, he was only the administrator. He was a de facto ruler. The actual ruler was his wife's brother, because he was the direct disciple of his predecessor, Krishna Devaraya, the illustrious ruler. So this Ramaraya was only an administrator, and therefore he always he held a grudge in his heart that he is a son-in-law, hired to be son-in-law. That's what he thought of himself. And so he was not very happy with that, and he always felt that he belonged to a different lineage as such, to the line of Chalukyas, another great Kannada rulers. So he always thought that he comes from the Chalukya kingdom, but he is only an administrator of the Vijayanagara kingdom. So this makes him create a grand narrative of his own. He never really submitted himself to the needs of his people, and all this coming together led to the downfall of Vijayanagara kingdom. So this is a very brief rendering of the plot as such. Now let me go into Karnad's problems in what I see as problems in Karnad's reading. In this, I would focus on two ideas. One is the private versus public domain debate, and also, as I mentioned earlier, a debate between the forms of historical drama and historiographical narratives. Now, the play, Crossing to Talikota, it is typified by one of the most common concerns of historical drama. A private versus personal, a private/personal versus public debate as such. The domestic space is always at the center of dramatic action within the play. For instance, the major character, the most important character, the protagonist Ramaraya, his obsession with his lineage causes his downfall. If that causes his downfall, the victory of the sultans, the Bahmani kingdom, it lies in the coming together of Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur, Ibrahim Qutub Shah of Golconda, and Hussein Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar as a family. It's only after they come together as a family that they manage to trounce the Vijayanagara kingdom. With the weddings between the daughters of Ahmednagar, that is Hussein Nizam Shah's daughters, and Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur and Ibrahim Qutub Shah of Golconda, the conglomerate that was already there among the sultans, it turns into a confluence. It becomes a confluence. There is a cultural unity as such. Of course, it need not be cultural. It may be, if one sees culture as an extension of family, one could read that way. But even otherwise, it is a familial confluence. And this idea that the warring Muslim princes and sultans, they must come together in a marriage alliance, according to the play, is given to Hussein Nizam Shah by his wife, Begum of Ahmednagar, and she decides who should marry who and what should be given to who, so as to make this marriage alliance work. So she comes up with an idea of transacting the forts under their control and uses them as currency, as dowry, in order to win over the sultan. So you see that this idea is a very practical one, and it does not come with any emotional baggage attached to it. It's a very practical, almost utilitarian kind of an idea. Now, Begum comes up with this particular idea, and in the scene, Begum is actually tending to her ailing husband, applying poultice over his limbs in order to cure him of his ailment. And the entire scene is set in the Antahpura, the inner chamber of the Ahmednagar palace. All this is very interesting because the most potent political plan in the play originates from one of the very private spaces within the play. And that too, when Begum is trying to give form to her idea, she is engaged in one of the most commonplace wifely duties within courts, of course. She is applying poultice to her husband, almost like a therapy, her psychological therapy, almost like a counseling, is beautifully represented in her physical act of trying to apply poultice in order to tend to her, relieve him of his pain, tend to her husband and relieve him of his pain. So one of the most common domestic activities, but it has very, very deep political and historical ramifications. This, I use it only as an illustration of how the Karnad's play tries to show that within the Indian context, or at least in the context of the play, the personal or the domestic domain interferes directly with the public domain. This has, we will take it up a little later for further explications. Domestic sphere has it has impinged upon the public domain. It has deep influence on the public domain. It is true even at the level of character. There are plenty of examples examples of how the private space interferes with public activities, public decisions, or at least decisions that have a bearing on the course of history. Of course, both public and private domains are entail politics in them. That it doesn't mean that only public domain is political and private is not. Private is obviously, it is seeped with tremendous political discourse. But what is interesting is that the private and domestic, in Karnad's play, private and domestic sphere seems to direct. So for Begum, the political pawns do not move very differently from what the domestic dice dictates. So she basically approaches the problem of Vijayanagara and the problem of defeating Vijayanagara and how the Vijayanagara kingdom is becoming unbearable. She approaches it in the same way she would have approached familial issue. That's what the play says. This impinging of the private domain on the public sphere is represented even at the level of character. For instance, if you take up Ramaraya, the protagonist, his personal whims, fancies, his fantasy causes his downfall, according to Girish Karnad. He has always been shown to involve himself in adamant antics, almost like as if his antics reach pathological proportions. So he interferes with Muslim sultans' internal affairs, and even, for that matter, their private issues. And Ramaraya cannot draw a boundary between administration of a particular kingdom and also administration of self. A very ironical interpretation of Gandhiji's Swarajya in a way. Ramaraya does not seem to regard Vijayanagara as a public sphere that demands his attention at all. His focus is completely turned towards himself. He is so much self-absorbed, and the play makes it very clear that not once does Ramaraya take an advice from any other characters. And not only that, other characters seldom get a chance to speak their minds when they are around Ramaraya. In fact, the very first words that the audience, very first words that Ramaraya's wife, Satyabhama, utters about her lifelong companion is, let me quote it, I had warned him 100 times, he wouldn't listen. So these words, the very first piece of information about the protagonist's personality that the audience is privy to, is one of his obstinance, how self-absorbed this person is. More than this, his self-absorption is complete, it's total. He has submerged himself in the melody of his own making. What is this melody? What is this melody of his own making? I hinted at this at the earlier stage. This melody is of his preoccupation with his lineage. He is unhappy that his role or his position within the kingdom, though he is the most powerful man in the south, it is one of an indentured indebtedness, his feeling of indebtedness, a filial fixation with his predecessor, the illustrious Krishnadevaraya. Krishnadevaraya appointed Ramaraya to be the administrator of Vijayanagara kingdom, and then he passed, and then the Vijayanagara kingdom was passed into the hands of Ramaraya. But Ramaraya could not sit on the throne because he did not have claim to the throne, as he did not belong to that particular lineage of rulers. So Ramaraya convinces himself that he belongs to another lineage. He is a descendant of another glorious lineage, which is of Chalukyas. So even as he is extremely strong and his word is final within the south, he feels insecure and probably suffers from a sense of inferiority because he cannot adorn the throne of Vijayanagara. So the fear of ending up an epigon of his illustrious father-in-law, it continuously bogs Ramaraya down. one can actually, it wouldn't be a mistake, one can go as far even to say that Ramaraya suffers from Bloom's burden, Herald Bloom's burden, the anxiety of influence. Of course, he uses in a very different context altogether, but the idea is that Ramaraya is under constant fear of not being able to outsmart, outdo his predecessor, which is Krishnadevaraya. This sort of an anxiety of influence bogs him down. There are many cases, or not, if not many, there are a couple of instances actually, where Ramaraya makes it very clear that he resents his one-time master, and these in a way betray what may be called an evolved Oedipal reflex against his predecessor. And this also represents itself in his callousness and his obstinance. And these are coupled with the self-styled grand narrative about one's own origins. And all these things come together and result in his fall. So, in a way, Girish Karnad treats the conglomerate or the confluence of the Bahmani sultans as just an eventuality. They are very practical, but they would have been ineffectual otherwise, but for this complexity within Ramaraya's character. So what Girish Karnad does, within the span of this text is to fix the reason for the fall of Vijayanagara kingdom entirely on Ramaraya and his self-styled fantasies and his antics, his psychological problems, issues, complexes, some sort of a pathological mind that he possesses. This it really makes me wonder, because there are ample evidence to show that probably this is not what actually happened. Of course, a creative writer has complete freedom to create his character as he wishes. However, Girish Karnad he has made it very, very clear that he takes research and accuracy of his play to be accurate in terms of historical facts. He has claimed that his play Crossing to Talikota can may even be considered a historic document in some sense. He takes this research very seriously and even accuses of some of his predecessors, the Kannada writers, to not have done proper research before writing historical plays. What Karnad does is to claim that his play is very, very authentic in terms of historical accuracy. He represents history itself as an intolerable burden thrust on the late 20th century urban individual. Like I said, this particular play offers a different reading of history. It goes against the accepted mainstream narrative that it was a clash of civilizations. It was Muslims versus Hindus and things like that. Rather, he says that there was nothing of that sort. There was nobody ever thought of themselves as waging a religious war. This is what Karnad proves. However, the play's ambivalence towards history, it is ambivalent because at a particular point it does not take the historical mainstream historical narratives very seriously. It subscribes to the post-colonial idea that one should read history against its grain. And it is not only the Oriental histories that we should read against the grain, but also the nationalistic narratives produced by our own people. So in a way, it does subscribe to the post-colonial sense of history. But at the same time, it it is fixated with factual history, because he also wants us to take history seriously. It's just that we should not take certain histories seriously. We should be very careful. This seems to be the position that Karnad holds. Of course, there is nothing wrong in itself, had it been just that. So that way, the play is somewhat ambivalent to history, but its ambivalence is not in the positive post-colonial sense. For all its clever accommodation of unconventional histories within the play, for instance, we can see that gestures and rumors also play a very important role, and how even gestures and rumors devise political strategies, and such incidents, we can see such incidents in play. So that way it has a very clever take on history, but it is surprising to see the author's fixation on factual history. Because we all know that to rely upon historical narratives of medieval India, or even after that, historical narratives produced by Oriental historians, we cannot always consider those narratives authentic. Of course, if Edward Said has shown us anything, this would be the most important takeaway, as it were, from Orientalism. So there is an irony of authenticity. We always know that the narratives of the West and also the narratives of the medieval period probably reveal more about the writers of such narratives than about the subject on which they have purportedly written such narratives. Now, Karnad knows this because he does take the Oriental history of Vijayanagara Empire with a pinch of salt. However, that sort of a skepticism is not is selective. It is not extended towards all histories. Only certain histories have been looked at with suspicion. We know that all historical narratives have been mediated by human memory, but the Karnad applies this idea to only some of the histories. In its preoccupation to posit the primary reason for the fall of the Vijayanagara Empire on the antics of Ramaraya alone, the play ignores ample evidence in historiographical narratives that maintain that ultimately religious intentions were also among the reasons for the Muslim kings to come into an alliance. For instance, there are a couple of historians, Ali Tabataba and also Rafiuddin Shirazi. Now these accounts are available and they have been translated into English, and these accounts provide ample evidence to prove that there indeed was a religious angle to the Battle of Talikota. Now, of course, we need not agree with these things, because we have come to know that some of the histories written by Muslim historians was informed by an agenda that they had to, of course, see the ruler in terms of how Islamic he is, because the Islamic rulers, of course, it is a general idea, had the purpose, they thought, that they have been chosen as rulers is to expand the kingdom of Allah in one sense or the other. So the historians, therefore, always evaluated the rulers with this idea in the background. So sometimes, for instance, Barani's evaluation of Tughlaq has been called into question, because they say that Barani dismisses Tughlaq because Barani did not see Tughlaq as an ideal Islamic ruler. So therefore, many things that Tughlaq did have been represented in a different light, is what the modern arguments are. So we may say that Karnad perhaps subscribed to this idea, and therefore was skeptical about Ali Tabataba's and Rafiuddin Shirazi's accounts. However, many of the incidents within the play have been directly taken from these accounts. Moreover, Karnad even quotes verbatim from these very accounts, and also certain readings of Ramaraya that are based on these accounts. He quotes Richard Eaton's analysis of Ramaraya, but Richard Eaton himself bases his observation on Shirazi's and Tabataba's accounts. So, on the one hand, Karnad is very happy to accept this analysis of Ramaraya's character, but at the same time, he is not ready to accept any evidence within these documents that prove that that sort of an analysis is reductive reading. For instance, if in a way, Karnad oversights this sort of an angle. It is far more curious because it is not a result of insufficient research. Karnad was indeed aware of these accounts. For instance, in Shirazi's account, if his accounts are to be believed, Ramaraya even placed in the court with great respect a copy of the Holy Quran, so that the Muslim noblemen in his court may pay respect to it and at their arrival to the court. He also is said to have built mosques within the capital city. And also at one incident is very, very interesting. Ramaraya's brother seems to have pleaded with Ramaraya to stop Muslims from killing animals in his kingdom. And Ramaraya is reportedly, he is reported to have replied that these Muslims have accepted your jobs for extending services, not to quit or change their religion. They should not be troubled so that they may serve you sincerely and loyally. Had Karnad made use of this episode in his play, I wonder, would it not have added more use to Ramaraya's character? I mean, it would certainly have made for great theatre if delivered with proper histrionics. Instead, as Karnad would have it, his Ramaraya turns out to be a vainglorious tyrant and a victim of self-inflicted fantasy. So this begs one question, and one is forced to wonder if the character of Ramaraya in Crossing, did it shed a shade or two to blend into his creator's ideological spectrum? Is Ramaraya sacrifice himself in order to create a counterpuntal reading of history? What we have in Karnad's reading is that Ramaraya turns out to be an Oriental despot. It is very, very ironical because Karnad himself, he has expressed it many times, had great suspicion towards Oriental historians who would turn the rulers, especially Muslim rulers of India, into such Oriental despotic figures. If we look at some readings of Mughals, for instance, Aurangzeb, for instance, we have this sort of a narrative, and Karnad doesn't subscribe to this idea. However, his rendering of Ramaraya is very, very akin to the figure of an Oriental despot. This idea of Oriental despotism, it is very interesting, and let me consider it in a little more detail. The idea of Oriental despotism originated from, of course, the Greeks. In Greece, it was a term that was used to describe or explain, or probably both, the Persian Empire and the rulers of the Persian Empire. So this idea of Oriental despotism, it was seen as a way of administration, a style of administration, which is in contrast with the Greece style of administration. We know that in Greece, and during those days, we had city-states, what is called polis, a polis. Now, this police would mean that the politicians, the elite rulers, the aristocrats, the noblemen, in other words, would come together and then they will debate issues of public policies. And we all know that, there is a very strong history, a very strong tradition of this debate. And so it was very much a public discourse. Public policy was very much a public discourse, and it was the noblemen who tried to debate this over in a particular public space. And the Oriental despotism was constructed in contrast to this sort of Greece, Greco-Roman polis, which was characterized by the blurring of the boundary between private and public domain, the interference of public whims and personal whims and fancies and fantasies into one's idea of administration. So what Karnad does in this particular play, probably you could have seen if we had the sultans coming together as a nascent stage of this sort of a polis, them coming together, leaving their personal, coming together against a hegemonic rule. Probably, Karnad could have seen a sort of an elementary or even if it is vulgar within quotes, a nascent polis in the making within the Indian subcontinent. But he doesn't do that, because even there, the idea itself of them coming together comes from the inner chambers, comes from as a family with so much of a familial transaction involved and in things like that. It is certainly not an answer to Greek polis. So, in a way, the administration that we see within the crossing of Talikota is a very, very, very close to this Oriental despotism. But evidently, Karnad, by his own admission, does not subscribe to this sort of an idea. He believes that the Western rational idea of ruling, we have seen that Aparna Darwadkar has shown us that he actually is a neo-traditionalist. He comes back to Suresh Avasthi has called his this sort of a theater as the theater of roots. One coming back to one's own roots to find inspiration. So Karnad is one such playwright who certainly is against the colonial discourse. But even as he's trying to deconstruct the colonial discourse, subscribes to some of the tropes that the colonial discourses put forward. Now, there are, for representing past, why Karnad does this? We know that it's because he's very, very worried about nationalistic, narratives of history taking predominance and trying to polarize the Indian public. We do understand that the fervor of the nationalistic narratives of history need to be challenged. There is no question about it. However, and then he does that, for representing the past in an unromantic and realistic mode, one must dig through the layers of solidified, simple-minded and single-dimensional peons, that have passed for history. However, what is problematic in Karnad's reading is that his treatment of history is selective. The events dramatized in Crossing and their principal actor, Ramaraya, seem to have been hammered down to fit into the political correctness of the 21st century. We can accuse, at least, if you agree with me, you can accuse Girish Karnad of presentism, to something that the Prime Minister of Netherlands had warned us against, or has warned us against. It is, I argued earlier that the principal character of crossing to Talikota Ramaraya suffers from an anxiety of influence. It's perhaps worth asking if his creator, that is Karnad, himself suffered from such an anxiety of influence too. But here, the anxiety of influence would not be from his predecessors, but the anxiety of influence influence of the context, the burden of a post-independent Indian playwright to present a picture that is not pretty but realistic, but also which is somewhat which has by default liberal and secular. Of course, I use every single term, every one of these terms within quotes. So this is what happens to Karnad. Karnad overlooks the evidence that are present in the historical documents that he himself refers to, overlooks such evidence and incidents that are contrary to the conclusion that he is arriving at. There is one more serious issue. I think I will finish my presentation in another presentation of my talk in another 5 minutes. So I'm sure it's a relief to you guys. But before I do that, there are a couple of things that I would like to take up. What is the purpose of creative art is one important question. Now even if we do not ask what creative arts or literature's purpose is, we must ask the question, what is its nature? We all, of course, we know from Bakhtin and many other critics that a literary work, if it has to be successful, it must be dialogic. It must represent multiple voices. It should not become a propaganda piece. It's interesting because history is a sphere in India, of course, especially in post-colonial India. History is a domain where very vigorous political battles are waged. And Vijayanagara Empire, the history of Vijayanagara Empire in itself is one such, episode of history where these ideological battles have been waged, where Hindu versus Muslim and these kind of things. So when Karnad is trying to caution us against this sort of polarizing reading of history, shouldn't he have strived to make his own play more inclusive? How would he justify the selective treatment of history? It becomes an important question. That is, at one level, that literature must accommodate different voices. We know that. And that would have definitely made this particular play far more interesting than, of course, it is still an impressive feat, but it would have become a far more permanent kind of an achievement had Karnad tried to make crossing more of an inclusive one. It becomes, at one level it is not polyphonic. At the other level, a piece of literature or any creative art for that matter must also be self-reflexive enough to turn an ironical eye towards itself. We have learned this from the great writers of history. Any great writer, especially Shakespeare, if we see, several. I don't think there is not even a single writer who has been acknowledged to be very impressive, who does not display this sort of who does not display this sort of an attitude, which is an ironical self-reflexivity. I mean, this has been termed in different terms, negative capability and things like that, to doubt one's own position and to express it in a solid manner within the form of course, not in the form of direct statement, but to undercut one's own ideological position is a very necessary aspect of an influential literary work. And Karnad has such a wonderful opportunity to do that. It's a tragedy that Karnad fell short of this. And had he achieved it, it would have been such a glorious exit, if I may, for Karnad from the Indian theatre scene. The last point that I would like to speak about is Karnad also does not take the fundamental dialogue of form and narration of historical drama and historiography very seriously. I mean, what is the nature of narration of a historical drama, and how is it different from the narrative, historiographical narratives? This is a fascinating question that every historical drama at one level or the other addresses. Of course, Karnad, it's not that Karnad has turned a blind eye towards this idea. He has taken it up, but it has not been made prominent. It has not. It should have been an integral issue. But I think again the ideological preoccupation did it limit Karnad from making his work more versatile is another question. I will not speak much on this particular question. I would not like to explicate. I think we should consider this question as a way forward kind of an idea, and then see what else Karnad could have done if he had made this fundamental question in his play. And also we can think about it when we reflect about history in general, and especially when we consider post-colonial history. With this, I think I will wind up my presentation. Of course, I'm attempting to write a paper out of my reading of Crossing, and these are some of the references that I have used. Of course, some of it does. Okay, so I thank all of you for cooperating with me, and thank you very much, and I thank Avilash Kaushik for thinking of me. Now, let me end my presentation, my talk. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you so much, sir. Sometimes we really wish that we keep on listening to the person for a long time without any interruption. Today we are feeling the same. The way Prabhas sir explained the topic in insightful manner is just incredible, and I'm sure that after listening to you, no one will like such interruption which I am causing. So I thank you so much for this lecture, and now I will quickly hand over the session to Abhilash for question answer part. Participants are requested to write their questions on the live chat box so that it will be put forward by Abhilash, and they can get their answers. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Sneha Madam. Professor, it was amazingly good. Thank you so much. Starting from historicity to historiography, you did an absolutely wonderful job, sir. Thank you so much for that. And okay, we'll now move ahead to the presentations of the participants in terms of their own questions. I have a question by our own Chitra Madam, first of all. And she has the question, which I will read it out. What do you think, sir, with Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press continuing to be the most academic publishing, how much has the Indian publishing industry claimed to have decolonized itself after even 73 years of independence?
Right. I must thank Dr. Chitra Dasgupta for that question. Now, this is an interesting question, but I think that we should not approach this particular debate in a simplistic manner. Even if Oxford, University Press and Cambridge University Press are some of the leading publishing industries in not just in India, everywhere else, it is also important for us to acknowledge that there seems to be a very conscious effort from these two presses and several other presses to accommodate diverse voices. Of course, one can go and take the example of people of all sorts of political opinions being invited to speak on their platforms, including Oxford University. Of course, that's a different institution compared to Oxford publishing industry. But these two publishing houses have also published several books that attempt at deconstructing colonial narratives and also trying to show how inhumane the colonial discourses were, and how difficult the colonial legacy has become for us to shed as such. So that way, just because the publishing houses are they're European and English in this case, doesn't mean that one shouldn't. I mean, this would then become a vulgar style of like vulgar Marxism. To say that in order to create a just and equal system, every person, every rich man must give up his wealth. That is not the idea. So similarly, to be a post-colonial doesn't mean to disconnect oneself from our erstwhile colonizers. The meaningful dialogue is what we must. And both these publishing houses are known to have given freedom to their editors, and these editors in many cases have been Indians. In fact, Karnad himself was one of the editors of the Oxford University Press, and when he was at the helm, he is known to have published works that are critical of colonial legacy. So to become deterministic about our responses to post-colonial, the erstwhile colonies, is to overdo post-colonial. That in itself is the terrorism of cultural sensitivity, so to speak. I think I have answered that question.
Okay, sir. The next question is by Pansali Datta Madam. She says that, in what way do you think post-colonialism had an impact on Indian culture?
Oh my God! I mean, thank you so much for the post. In what way has post-colonialism as a movement?
Yes, sir.
As a movement.
As a literary movement, yeah.
As a literary movement, of course, post-colonial theory has huge impact on every. It's not just Indian literary movement. It has had a huge influence on the literary movement worldwide, and not even literary movement for that matter. It had impact on the philosophical and intellectual movements globally as such. Now, if I have to answer it in a very brief way, let me just take up one example, and I would go back to Edward Said. Of course, we cannot distinguish post-colonial theory from post-colonial literature, because ultimately post-colonial theory it comes from the English department. It comes from the literary criticism. So if we in a way see Edward Said's Orientalism, it has to be seen that way, an attempt at interpreting representations within quotes, hermeneutical strategies used against representations of the Orient by the Oriental historians. Then it has shown that what representation does and how should one look at oneself, and it has also brought into the question the idea of authenticity. After Orientalism, we have come to understand the complexity of representation and what literature in itself has done, and from there onwards our literatures have become far more self-reflexive, far more accommodating and things like that. This is just a very simple example. I mean, it's a very broad question. So, and I think if I have to answer it in a line, in a sentence, there hasn't been any area of Indian literature that has not been influenced by post-colonial theories.
Okay, sir. The next question is by Mr. William Pinto. He says, can you say that the problems which we encounter in modern writings actually reflect the present scenario of the 21st century?
In the modern writings, is it?
Yes, sir.
This goes without saying. One cannot, whether it is literature or any other creative art, one cannot produce anything out of vacuum. We always respond to the contemporary situation. We are always in engagement with the content. For instance, after having gone through the pandemic that we are experiencing now, wouldn't this help us in understanding the plague quarantines and the medieval period better? Better in the sense, wouldn't it give us an insight into what they were going through during those times? So obviously, it is impossible to do anything to produce anything without the present context, without our context bearing upon our productions. So that goes without saying. There is no doubt about that.
Yes, sir. The next question is by Jyoti Patil. Madam, see, what's your view on the interface of politics of emotions harnessed in the imperialism of nations as explained in the works of Karnad? What is your view?
Would you be able to repeat the question, please? Would you be able to?
Yes, sir. What is your view on the interface of politics of emotions in the various works of Girish Karnad?
All right. Okay. This is again another very interesting question. Yeah, this probably is at the heart of my talk as well. The idea that now, if we here, let me answer it in two different levels. If we talk about politics of emotions, and if we are talking about the gamut of Karnad's production, emotion does have a very prominent position in Karnad's writings. We have seen Hayavadana, for instance. We have also gone through Yayati. We have seen Nagamandala. And all of these plays are in a way critique of reason. And the politics of emotions is at the heart of these plays. But yes, now when we consider politics of emotions, I do not understand whether you would want me to respond to Karnad's own treatment of emotions in a selective manner. That if you want me to do that, that would be, this probably is not the platform to do that. That is at one level. That means definitely the emotions have predominated over this one. Now at the second level, if we define the politics of emotion as the victimhood that we claim for ourselves, that has not really had too much of a negative impact on Karnad. I don't think Karnad has produced the so-called pathetic narratives. He does not see the Indian post-colonial or even colonial, during the colonial, the Indian subjects as victims of certain way of victims of colonial discourse. Obviously, we were victims, but he doesn't get fixated over claiming that victimhood and perpetuating it. He is that way. It's a great improvement on some of the earlier writings for earlier writers. However, he understands us as the post-colonial subjects of India, or even during the nationalistic period. He thinks that the Indian subjects have become victims of another sort of colony. When the nationalist leaders started reinventing themselves, when they came up with glorious narratives about our past, etc., even that was as a response to the colonial presence. We know that. And Karnad thinks that this in itself has created a very negative impact on the present situation, and we are victims of that sort of polarizing, right-leaning narratives of history. So Karnad is more interested in looking at the victimhood of the post-colonial subjects from this angle, how we are now at the second level of subjugation. The narratives that avowedly came into existence in order to free us, liberate us from the colonial baggage, in themselves have enslaved us. So this is what Karnad and Vijay Tendulkar and his contemporaries are responding to. Even Chandrasekhar Kambar, for that matter, are responding to. So we are still, he sees this, that his position is to create a very authentic, realistic way of looking at ourselves. And that perhaps helps us in freeing ourselves from the baggage of the nationalistic, from the burden of nationalistic history, which in itself is very, very polarizing. So, but it is still interesting that he does not flash the victim card so much as we see it in some less influential and less impressive writings that belong to that people have produced during these days. No, in that way, his politics of emotion is not to go about and say, "Oh no, we have been wronged, and therefore our entire life must be." It must be a mission to liberate ourselves from this terrible curse. No, that he does not take that way. That way, Karnad is slightly closer to Walcott. Walcott wants to live in the world of new history. He rejoices the historylessness of the Caribbean islands. But Karnad cannot do that, obviously, because in Indian context, there is no idea of historylessness. However, Karnad also revels in the idea that we should not get fixated with what the colonies did or what the colonizers did, but we need to be wary of our own, our own colonizers as such. The propaganda machinery of modern day, and also the polarizing, whether right or left for that matter. I mean, it would be wrong on my part to say that it is just the right-leaning historians or right-leaning intellectuals or right-leaning activists who do this. But his idea, he responds to this context. Therefore, the politics of emotion in the context of Karnad is that way more subtle.
Okay, sir. The next question is by Sanjukta Madam. She says that we are so deeply ingrained in our post-colonial ideas that we tend to forget our rich cultural heritage. How has post-colonialism impacted our own mindset?
Yeah, this is exactly what I wanted to demonstrate through this lecture. But again, I have to respond to your question with a conditional. When we say rich legacy, that before the before colonization, India was such a glorious civilization, and we had our own golden era, and after the colonial period, it was during the colonial period that we lost. Now, this sort of a narrative, we need to take these sort of narratives with a pinch of salt. It doesn't mean that there was nothing good about India even before the advent of the Western powers. Of course, there were several wonderful things, but it is also not right to think of India as a place of, there is some of the common narratives that India was the place of aviation industry. There was aerospace engineering, all the technology was here, we invented surgery. These sort of claims, of course, there may be some basis in some records to prove that people were thinking along these lines, but it is very hard to believe that these technologies existed earlier as they do today. But even otherwise, so we have to be very, very skeptical of these sort of a claim. But even otherwise, it is true. It is also very true that when we take post-colonial sentiments very, very seriously, we have followed the Western idea of de-hegemonizing Western or whatever, de-hegemonization too seriously. We need to understand that dialogue must be at the center of all our efforts. The first today, what is happening is that in the quest of becoming post-colonial identities, we have discredited ourselves. That's why I gave the example of Netherlands, the idea of golden age. I am very, very certain that even though there were problems during the golden age in the Netherlands, there was plenty that was good. And that way, we can't go discrediting ourselves of all our achievements, though we need to be cautious at saying that we had everything and India was the cradle of all civilization. And this sort of narrative is also very, very dangerous. So we need to somehow strike a balance. The claiming victimhood, if we do that, it results in cacophony. And dialogue is the first casualty of cacophony. So I think our responsibility is to find a middle ground where we will not unduly glorify ourselves. At the same time, we will not distance ourselves from the erstwhile colonizers, and we will not claim victimhood. At the same time, we do not think that we deserve to be colonized. So we need to find a middle ground between all these different ways of responding to colonization.
Okay, sir. In relation to your answer, Chitra ma'am has replied. She has a comment for you. She says, "Thank you, sir, for your enlightening attitude of exchange and dialogue and your appreciation irrespective of national or cultural identities. Thanks a lot." She says that.
I reciprocate her gratitude.
Okay, sir. Then we have the next question by Mr. Sarfraz Nawaz. He says, "Sir, don't you think decolonizing the mind is the only way out?" I think he is referring to Bugi wa Kyongo.
Yeah, Thiango. Now, again, when we say decolonizing the mind, I mean, is it even possible? When Thiango wrote it, I think it is very, very relevant when to the way we create our literary narratives. To what extent should our language be colonial? Yeah, at that level, I think what Thiango says is very relevant and very useful. But as citizens of a post-colonial society, is it really possible to decolonize? I mean, actually, what decolonize means, in my view, is that we need to actually come out in yes, it is true. Decolonizing mind is the only way, but decolonizing the mind has to happen at a deeper level. For instance, S.N. Balagangadhara has given us a way forward what would be decolonizing, what does it mean to decolonize our minds? Decolonizing our minds does not mean that we will start writing in our languages alone, but also to not borrow concepts that are true at a different context, and borrow them and apply to the Indian context. I think Ashish Nandi also has been speaking about this problem for a long time now. For instance, let us take up the idea of feudalism. Vivek Dhareshwar has spoken about it. In a recent talk, Vivek Dhareshwar spoke about this particular example. He spoke about how people have been using the word feudal very loosely in India, or the idea of secular. Who is a secular is secular. What do we mean by fundamental duties, fundamental rights? These sort of concepts. Now, these concepts originated, from a particular context within the Western society. And Balagangadhara and others believe that when the Western intellectuals, when the people from the West came to the Eastern societies or other societies, when they looked at the world here, they did not understand it. So they tried to understand this world by kind of creating, comparing and contrasting with their own world. So immediately they looked at Bhagavad Gita and say that we have the Bible and here Bhagavad Gita is their scripture. But we know that, in India, Bhagavad Gita, we don't really look at Bhagavad Gita as a scripture. Of course, it's a very important text for us. But then it is, whether it's a scripture or not is a different question altogether. So we have been using these concepts that we borrow from the West without being conscious about that. So if we have to decolonize our mind, this is what we need to do. That is why many people, in a way, decolonizing mind is not at the level of language, but it is at the level of doing. Ashwin Kumar AP has demonstrated this in his writings, that what Gandhi was trying to do was this, that he was trying to decolonize the self at the level of action. Otherwise, today it would look like, even Gandhi's ideas may look like antics to some. But what he was trying to do through, trying to win independence via self-regulation is trying to attain Swarajya, is decolonizing the self at the level of action. That means action cannot be performed in vacuum, right? So they will be informed by concepts. And if we try to perform action that are informed by our own concepts, then that is the best way of decolonizing the mind. So that is my response. I don't think Ngugi has spoken about decolonizing the mind this way. So if we are to subscribe this idea, then we have to do it much more rigorously than Ngugi himself advocated.
Madam Gunjan Chaturvedi says, what is your view on the contemporary relevance of historical plays by Karnad?
Oh yes, I mean, every single play of Girish Karnad has very contemporary, great relevance to the contemporary times, and his history, it is the nature of all historical drama, that the present time, our own context, has a bearing upon the way we look at the past. I mean, the greatest example would be The Crucible in American literature. To the McCarthy period, so that particular period was used, and that experience was used, and the Salem witch trials were read in the new light. So all historical plays read history, not just to find out what happened then, etc., but they always read history from the present context. In fact, Bernard Shaw says certain things about his own characters. He says that I do not want to recreate the dialogue spoken by my characters. I would write dialogues for them, for the kind of dialogues that they would have spoken if they had known what they were doing. That's what Bernard Shaw says. That he says that his responsibility, the writer's responsibility is to recreate the historical characters and historical events from the experience of the present. So it is very, very relevant, even for Karnad. It is important, and it is true of all historical plays as such. Now, how is it relevant is what this particular talk was about. That in Karnad's historical plays, Tughlaq, and there is one on Tipu Sultan, and then there is one on Talikota, the Vijayanagara Empire. All these three plays are trying to deconstruct the mainstream narratives of history. Tughlaq is probably to a lesser extent so, but it is by far the most successful in doing so. Probably Tughlaq was not written with that agenda, that being an agenda, but still it does it in a very effective manner. So the historical plays will allow us to read history in a new way. For instance, this particular play, must have been true that Ramaraya's psychological complexity led to had a bearing on the way he went about administrating his empire, his kingdom. So we cannot discredit Karnad. We cannot say that that is not important. Probably it is important, and it allows us to look at history and also present context in a different light. And his position is that we need to be skeptical about received notions of history, and we need to try to recreate what might have happened, not only at the level of events, but also at the level of psychology of the actors involved.
Daisy Sonowal Madam says, Sir, what is your view on the post-colonial subalternization in the play The Fire and the Rain, Hayabadna and Nagamandala?
I have not read Fire and the Rain, sorry. But yes, Hayabadna and Nagamandala. Let me take Nagamandala as a good example. It is an answer to the subalternization of within the post-colonial subject. So almost all plays of Karnad, they are anti-realistic and anti-modern, and ironically, this is Aparna Dharwadkar's argument, by the way. Ironically, the women characters they are brought into the forefront. Not only are the women character, I said I'll speak about Nagamandala. What happens in Nagamandala is, what is given attention is not just the women character, but also something that a woman is not supposed to exhibit openly, which is her own sexuality. So Nagamandala foregrounds these ideas, thus far marginalized character of a woman is brought to the forefront. Not only is the character given agency at the level of the play, but also certain things that were taboo for women to speak about, etc., are actually celebrated. In a way, Nagamandala liberates the principal woman character. And this is true of many plays of Karnad, and it is true even of Chandrasekhara Kambar for that matter. So Karnad's plays, and it is true of many other, say Vijay Tendulkar, for instance. Silence, the court is in session, is an excellent case in point. Even there, again, the extramarital affair of Miss Benare is not something that she need not be ashamed of, but it is something that that is an eventuality and something that must be actually celebrated. The play does celebrate her sexuality and the extramarital affair that Miss Benare has. So that way, all these plays are continuously responding to the process of marginalization of this, post-colonial subject, and they, in their own spaces, textual spaces, provide ample opportunities and ample ways of liberating these marginalized voices.
Then, Sir, Sana Tabassum Madam says, Sir, how is Karnad's Tughlaq a contemporary political allegory?
Yeah, contemporary this. A simple glance at the newspaper is enough to show how relevant it is. But I think it is even a bigger allegory to the time when it was written, during the time when the the play was written. It was considered to be a statement on the disillusionment that the newly independent India suffered, because they expected Nehruvian vision to lead India into a glorious future rather. But this sort of an expectation fizzled out, and Nehruvian socialism did not really prove to be very successful, and immediately disillusionment set in. So in a way, it is seen that Tughlaq's fall is denouement. It was seen by many as a clear representation of that sort of a disillusionment. And at a later point, during the time of emergency, again Tughlaq became relevant, because it then started showing what happens when a ruler is completely engrossed in oneself and tries to go to any extent in order to realize his own dreams and fantasies and things like that. So in that case, during the period of Indira Gandhi, Tughlaq again became relevant, because then it would seen as perfect. The fall in Tughlaq in a way mirrored the fall in the Indira Gandhi in Indira Gandhi herself, from a lady, charismatic lady who promised so much to a person. I mean, we don't know who did it. Of course, there are narratives saying that Indira Gandhi was basically sidelined during emergency. But anyway, if we ignore it, then if we assume that Indira Gandhi was responsible, then how she became almost monstrous, and that way Tughlaq's own transformation was mirrored in that transformation. Now, if we have to come back, if we have to come to the present moment, even now, I think a lot of propaganda and a lot of strategies where religious sentiments have been used, are being used by the leaders. I mean, it's not of one party for that matter. Every party, every single party in the present Indian context, how it uses these religious and other emotional issues in order to gain political mileage is again, it mirrors the strategies that Tughlaq adopted himself. Of course, these are reductive ways of mapping the relevance of Tughlaq to the present age. But even if I am just using these as hints, so that way, yes, Tughlaq is very, very relevant. Of course, any good piece of literature would continue to be relevant.
Chandrima Sen, Madam says, Sir, can we make a feminist or co-feminist reading of the plays by Karnad?
Oh, why not? I mean, there have been several attempts to do that. In fact, one of my own colleagues is attempting to look at the women characters. And of course, there is plenty of opportunity if one wishes to take up such a reading.
Then Madam Parvita Bora says, Sir, I want to know about the influence of post-colonialism on the marginalized people.
Oh, well, I will answer it in a single sentence. Post-colonial theory has been striving to lend voice to the marginalized people. So since the advent of post-colonial studies, several people who had been marginalized have been given prominence, at least within the intellectual, textual space of intellectual debates.
Then Sonia J. Nair, Madam, says that, Sir, what do you think about Oxford firing their own translation team? I think that there is no intersectionality between the regional languages and the English language.
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of this particular incident. I don't know how to respond to that, because I don't know what was the reasons behind the translation team being fired. What was the second part of the question?
There is no intersectionality between the regional language and English. She says that.
I think
we can find any point of intersection as such.
Yeah, I mean, that is what we are arriving at, actually. I mean, if we trace the history of post-colonial literature just in India alone, there is plenty of possibilities. I mean, Karnad again is a case in point. He translated his plays from Kannada to English himself. And it's, I mean, of course, we are not talking about language here. We are talking about minds. I think there is a way of, we are finding such points of intersection. And this is a continuous process. It's not that it happens at a particular point and we have reached the pinnacle of it. It's a continuous process because engagement is continuous.
Any Saifi madam says, sir, how far Girish Karnad's work similar to British literature?
No, they, okay, but this is a, I think we can say that to an extent, the structure of some of his plays have been influenced by the kind of, but again, even there, I think we should not try to look at, the British plays, the English plays of Great Britain and Karnad. We know that Karnad's influences are very indigenous as such. He claims, he himself has made it very clear that he was influenced by the company natak that was very popular, especially in the Maharashtra and Karnataka, and also from the Kannada theatre tradition of Yakshagana. And also we know that he looks towards the Indian myths and Indian histories and our own folk tales for inspiration. But it's impossible to say that the English plays did not have an impact on Girish Karnad. Obviously, they did have. I think the English plays may have helped Karnad to structure his plays with greater control, if I have to say. But more than English plays, I think the ideas of postmodernity, where for ideas that there is no one history, but there are multiple histories, and even in crossing to Talikota, the structure is such that it is almost like a cycle. It starts with the play begins and ends with the same scene, and then the tale is actually narrated in a flashback mode, which is very fitting considering this is a historical play. So he is, I think, more influenced by the post modern plays as such. But I think the influence is more indigenous that way than Western.
Okay, so we'll take up one last question because more or less every question is almost the same. That question is by Madam SM. She says that, sir, doesn't a writer have something called a writer's license? Unlike
yes, right. You're right. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Unlike the historiographers, because he thinks that historiography itself is a biased document of the dominant culture.
Right, yeah, like the old cliche goes, history is written by winners. I am very thankful to the person who has raised this question. Obviously the writer has a license. For instance, I quoted Bernard Shaw, who has created historical plays, but they are very, very different from actual historical characters. He even went to the extent saying that he had not even read those histories before writing the plays. So we do not really hold it against Bernard Shaw for having created characters. That is absolutely fine. But the problem is when a writer claims that a particular play is historically accurate and then he has done tremendous research and who takes great pride in saying that his play is actually very, very accurate and it reflects reality and it also tries to give life to events on stage as it happened during those times. And Karnad explicitly claims that his play is, it can even be in some sense can be accorded the position of a historical document. Having done so, if one shows tendencies of selective treatment of history and also less self-reflexive attitude, then it becomes a problem. This was my argument. Had Karnad just considered crossing to Talikota just a rereading without much of a without history, without allowing history to have a bearing on this, then I don't think many of my arguments would have mattered so much. I would still have found fault with the play not being able to be self-reflexive, but at least I couldn't have gone ahead and said that its treatment of history is selective. That is not possible. The problem is when reading received history against the grain becomes so much of an agenda, and trying to and the attempt to make one's own play politically correct becomes such a big agenda. And this agenda, in a way, turns a blind eye towards history and the details of history that are so complex and they're so rich as such. Then we have a problem. And the problem is not that, had it been an inferior writer, a person with lesser capabilities, then obviously again this would. But we know that the Karnad's potential is beyond doubt, and we know that if at all there was a playwright who was capable of writing a play that is richer than what he has written, it would have been Karnad. That is why this particular play goes on to show how much of a bearing our the current political atmosphere has on a writer. I think that the prominent political ideology of at least at the intellectual scenario, at the intellectual level in India, is so much worried about political correctness and such issues that it really cripples creative writer. This, I think, has been exhibited in this particular play, and that was that was the crux of my critique. It's not that Karnad doesn't. I mean, for instance, majority of my arguments cannot be raised if my text was Nagamandala, for that matter. It's only when he claims that this is a historical document and then goes on to betray his political affiliation, then the play becomes a problem.
So just now one question has come by someone who you know really well. It is by Chaitra.
Right.
Okay. The question is, has Girish Karnad used any kind of perspectives by Nehru in this particular play?
No, I mean, again, in this particular play, I don't think he was responding to Nehru so much. I had never, I've not thought about it, because it was very clear that it was trying to respond to the events that happened after 2010, 2010 onwards. So I had never spared a thought on how much of a Nehruvian politics had a bearing upon this one. I need to think about it. Since it's Chaitra, maybe I can respond to her, later on after having thought about it.
Okay, sir. And finally, we have come to the end of the session. So all I can say is that you have just opened a wide field of further debates as such. Because whenever we talk about post-colonialism as a movement, we generally think of something which we have always longed for. Something finally that the time has come, and then we are having the thing which we have always wanted to have without really taking into account of the problems. And your discussions have really paved the way for further, in a way, encounters in terms of how history can be problematized. At the same time, history can be an element which is really problem in itself, right, in terms of its own understanding.
Right.
That is what I really think. Is it so, sir? Can we relate in that specific way?
Obviously, yes, absolutely. It is possible for us to consider looking into post-colonialism that way.
Okay, then, sir, thanks a lot so much. You have been really amazing. Your discussions, your ideas, your thoughts have really been provoking one for us to go for further debates and discussions. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you very much, Abhilash.
One last time for my dear participants, the feedback link will be posted just after the session on the description box, and also it will be given on the Telegram group. And I request to fill the feedback only by those participants who attended the session. Okay, sir. Once again,
thank you. Let me before you conclude, again, let me thank you and all the organizers of AIFEST, for allowing me, an opportunity, for giving me an opportunity to present my views here. And you have taken so much pains to organize these things, and I wish you all the best. And again, I would like to thank you. And I also thank all the participants for giving me a patient hearing. I suppose it was a patient hearing. I thank
Yes, sir.
one, I thank one and all. Thank you very
Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you so much.
much.